Get her off my stage. I won't share it with a street performer." Those were the maestro's last words before the crowd abandoned him mid-concert, captivated by the very girl he had humiliated. In a stunning tale of poetic justice, Elitist Conductor refused to share stage with street pianist. Then she played and took his career follows Amara, a gifted yet overlooked young woman whose soulful performance not only redefines the meaning of music, but reshapes the legacy of an entire institution. Humiliated, silenced, and dismissed, she turns her pain into power and transforms the stage into something it had never been before, a home for truth. This is not just a story about music. It's about reclamation, resilience, and the moment a single performance rewrote everything. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. You expect me to perform with her? In front of royalty and the press? Victor Lang's voice cut through the velvet drapes like a razor across silk. The assistant conductor flinched, holding the program with trembling fingers. "Sir, with the Parisian prodigy missing her flight and every replacement booked, she's the only one available. But please, listen, she's remarkable. Her video's online. I don't give a damn about videos." Victor's mouth twisted with disdain. TikTok sensations do not belong in a concert hall built on centuries of genius. This isn't some sidewalk busking slot on Bourbon Street. This is my stage, my orchestra, my name on every column. Outside the gilded dressing room, the buzz of the gala rippled down the corridors. Champagne laughter, the flick of heels on marble, music dignitaries, sponsors, foreign dignitaries, and critics. It was to be the most prestigious night of the season. A charity gala for children's music programs where every note was expected to be perfection. Inside, tension bloomed like a bruise. "She's waiting in the green room, Maestro," the assistant murmured, softer now. "She thought she was here for a chance, not a humiliation." Victor's eyes narrowed, a storm tightening. He stood, towering, his black tailcoat still draped over a leather armchair. His silver cufflinks gleamed like ice. "Get her out. Quietly. I won't share my stage with a beggar who pretends talent can replace training." "But she's self-taught, sir, and people say when she plays, something happens. It's like she knows how to." I said no. At that same moment, Amara sat alone in a side room 3 doors down. The fabric on the armchair beneath her was too fine, like it knew she didn't belong. She had crossed the threshold into this world by accident, a world of chandeliers, monograms, and concert pianos buffed until they gleamed like obsidian. Her calloused fingers tightened in her lap. She hadn't asked for this. An agent had heard her playing outside Jackson Square, had slipped a business card into her coat pocket, had told her she might be called on if the right moment arose. That moment, apparently, was tonight. But now, something was wrong. The air had shifted. She could feel it, like the silence before a thunderclap. And still, somewhere deep inside, she held on to hope. Maybe they'd ask her to play just one piece. Maybe the rumors were wrong about Maestro Lang. Maybe tonight would be different. But the door creaked open. The assistant conductor entered with eyes full of apology. He didn't have to speak. She stood before he could finish his sentence, her dignity upright, even as her heart slid down her spine like ice water. "I understand," she whispered. She walked past him, through hallways she hadn't earned the right to know, toward the service exit. A janitor with headphones nodded politely as she passed. The corridors smelled of polish and panic. Somewhere beyond the main doors, a violin was tuning. Outside, the sky bruised with the oncoming evening. She sat on the back steps, pulling her coat tight, not because it was cold, but because she needed something to hold on to. Inside, Maestro Victor Lang adjusted his cuffs, the sound of applause already swelling in the great hall. The opening number went exactly as expected. The orchestra moved like machinery beneath his baton. Every downbeat hit with calculated grandeur, every crescendo lifted like a bird from a cage. The audience, cloaked in diamonds and old money, leaned in. They always did. But Amara's absence had left a thread uncut. Backstage, whispers started. Staff murmured about what had just happened. One of the volunteers, a young girl named Grace, posted about it on her social media. Maestro Lang just humiliated a street pianist outside. She was supposed to play. I heard her practice. She was incredible. He never even let her touch the stage. That post spread faster than a heartbeat. And so did the rumor. The pianist who was turned away is the girl who plays Chopin blindfolded on the corner of St. Louis Street. Suddenly, guests began whispering. Several had seen her online. A few had even passed her in the street before. They remembered her grace, the aching sorrow in her music, the way she played as if mourning something she couldn't name. One woman whispered to her husband, "I think that was the girl who played after my mother's funeral. We passed her on the way home. I wept in the car." Still outside, Amara didn't know that the tides were shifting. She only knew that her hands still ached to play, that her fingers still remembered the melody she'd practiced that morning with breathless hope. She found herself walking, not away from the hall, but around to the back. Near the lobby, tucked beside the cloakroom, stood a lone grand piano. It was part of the reception area, meant more for show than sound. But it was in tune. She knew by the air. She sat quietly. A few guests, lost between courses or disinterested in the overture, lingered near the entrance with wine glasses. They saw her. One man tilted his head. A woman raised an eyebrow. No name tag, no gown, no credentials. But then she played. It was a quiet entrance, a chord progression like a sigh in a church. The melody unfurled not with grandiosity, but with intimacy. Notes like confessions, echoes of old grief, wrapped in something warmer. The guests stilled. More gathered. A ripple traveled backward from the piano, pulling strangers from the hall's outskirts to the marble near her bench. Conversations dimmed. Wine was forgotten. Even the air conditioning hum seemed to hush. Inside the concert hall, Victor turned a page on his score, unaware that outside the main chamber, the audience was thinning. A tech assistant peeked into the crowd and pulled out his phone. He started recording. Not because he meant to cause a scene, just because he'd never heard anything like it. What Amara played next wasn't anything anyone knew. It was hers, an original piece she'd started years ago on a winter night, sleeping under newspapers in a shelter stairwell. It told a story of hunger and hope, of resilience in cracked fingernails and rain-soaked coats, a lullaby for the girl she used to be. And the hall filled with it. It passed through the stone floor into the souls of people who hadn't cried in years. It was not perfection, but it was truth. Somewhere in the back, the charity's founder, a woman named Elaine Carter, was moved to tears. In her mind, she saw the children the charity was meant to serve. And she saw Amara, not as a street girl who snuck into the lobby, but as one of them, grown, risen, shining. Elaine Carter stood frozen in her heels, one hand hovering just above her chest, as if her heart had physically risen in her throat. She didn't know who the girl was, not yet. But something about the way those fingers moved across the piano keys tore straight through her perfectly constructed exterior. A woman who had chaired 32 charity galas in 12 years was not easily shaken. Yet in that moment, watching this unknown figure pour herself into each note like it was the last truth she'd ever speak, Elaine felt undone. She took a small step forward. Behind her, more guests were trickling out of the hall. Not in protest, not in haste, but drawn by a magnetic pull they didn't fully understand. There was something primal in the sound. Familiar, but not from any concert program. It was like overhearing your own mother hum a lullaby through a memory you'd forgotten. Gentle, aching, impossibly human. Inside the concert hall, the orchestra played on. Maestro Lang didn't notice the first gap in the audience, nor the second. But by the third, a flicker of irritation crossed his brow. He paused longer than necessary at a page turn, casting a glance into the far aisles, empty seats, whispering ushers, his jaw clenched. In the lobby, Amara kept playing. She didn't see the people gathering behind her. She didn't know that some had started filming. She didn't know her name had begun to circulate, whispered from guest to guest like a secret blessing. All she knew was that something inside her had opened, and she was letting it speak. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about validation. It was about truth. About all the nights she'd curled around a piano's broken leg just to stay warm. About the mornings when tourists had dropped quarters instead of listening. About the moments she had doubted whether the music mattered at all. She played through them. The final chord lingered like incense. No one moved. A child near the back clapped first. One sharp, innocent clap that cut the silence. Then the rest followed. First in twos and threes, then a swell of it. Applause like a tide, surging forward, not forced or formal, but real. Amara stood, startled. She hadn't prepared for applause. She bowed out of instinct, uncertain if she should smile. That's when Elaine stepped forward, weaving through the crowd with the precision of a woman used to commanding rooms. But her expression was soft now, awestruck. "What's your name, dear?" she asked gently, her voice nearly drowned by the fading claps. "Amara," the girl said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Elaine nodded. "Do you have anywhere else to be tonight?" Amara blinked, confused. No. Elaine glanced toward a young usher who stood nearby. "Get me Robert from the AV booth, now." Inside the hall, the orchestra concluded their third piece. This time, the applause was thinner, more distracted. Victor could feel it now, the shift, the absence. He turned fully, taking in the vacant front rows. Then behind the stage doors, he caught the faint echo of something he hadn't expected to hear. Laughter. The sound of joy, bursting through the corridors like spring rain breaking through drought. "Where is everyone?" he snapped at the nearest stagehand. The man looked nervous. "In the lobby, Maestro." "What the hell are they doing in the lobby during my performance?" The stagehand hesitated. "They're listening to the pianist." "What pianist?" "The young woman, sir. The one you—" Victor's face darkened. He didn't let the man finish. Without another word, he threw down his baton and stormed off stage left, nearly colliding with a cellist in his haste. The orchestra, confused, murmured among themselves as the conductor vanished behind the curtain. Back in the lobby, Elaine was already on a makeshift microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention for just a moment." The crowd hushed immediately. This young woman was meant to play tonight, though many of you didn't know that. She was turned away, not because she lacked talent, but because she lacked credentials. And tonight, she just reminded us why music has nothing to do with pedigree and everything to do with soul. A murmur of agreement passed through the listeners like wind in tall grass. Elaine turned toward Amara. "Would you do us the honor of closing the evening's gala with one final piece? Not in the lobby, on the stage, where you belong." Amara froze. The weight of those words hit her like an unexpected tide. She'd spent years outside looking in, watching through smudged windows while others had their chance. She'd imagined it once, playing under lights instead of street lamps, hearing her name over applause rather than subway trains. But she had never allowed herself to believe it. Now they were asking her to step into that dream. She hesitated. Elaine touched her arm. "Only if you're ready." Amara looked down at her hands. For a moment, she remembered how many times they'd bled. How many times she'd played through numb fingers and bitter winters. They weren't elegant hands, but they were strong, and they had carried her here. "I'm ready." At that moment, Victor Lang stepped into the lobby. The crowd turned. He took in the scene, the standing ovation still lingering in the air, the makeshift stage around the old piano, the woman he'd dismissed now glowing under chandelier light like she was carved from moonstone. And standing beside her, Elaine Carter. "Elaine," Victor said tightly, his voice stiff with forced charm. "I see you found tonight's entertainment." Elaine's smile was thin but unyielding. "I have, and it seems she found her audience." Victor's eyes flicked toward Amara. "You don't understand what you're doing. You can't put an untrained performer on that stage." Elaine's voice dropped an octave, laced with calm steel. "I'm not putting her on the stage, Victor. She's earned it." For the first time in years, Victor Lang had no retort. Just silence. Just the weight of a legacy slipping through his fingers like sand. The stage had always been a dream Amara dared not name aloud. Now it stood before her, not a vision from behind glass, but a living, breathing possibility waiting to be stepped into. She walked slowly down the corridor, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished marble. Her worn shoes whispered against the floor like a memory that didn't belong. As she passed portraits of maestros and composers in gilded frames, she wondered how many of them had ever touched hunger, had ever prayed over a chipped piano in a soup kitchen, had ever been told they were nothing before being asked to play for everything. But her fingers felt warm, steady. Somehow, they knew the way forward, even when her mind still reeled. The double doors of the concert hall opened, and for the first time, Amara saw the stage from the center, not the shadows. Hundreds of faces, lighted arches stretching high above, rows of chandeliers like crystalline constellations. The hush that followed was not of boredom or expectation, it was reverence. The kind given not to performers, but to moments that shift something deep inside the soul. Elaine walked beside her, hand resting gently at the small of her back. "Play what your heart knows," she whispered. "That's all anyone came for tonight." Amara stepped forward. She didn't need to be told twice. The grand piano on stage gleamed under the lights, a creature of quiet power. She sat down gently as if not to wake it too soon. In the wings, Victor watched with arms crossed, his expression unreadable. His place, his podium remained untouched. The orchestra sat in a suspended breath, not yet dismissed but no longer led. For now the stage belonged to someone else. Amara closed her eyes, and then she began. The first notes rose like dawn over still water, slow, fragile, and almost shy. A melodic breath that tested the room's silence, asking permission. But then, the melody expanded, deepened, pulled taut by aching emotion that refused to be bound by technique alone. She did not play as a girl seeking approval. She played as someone telling the story of her life in the only language she had ever truly trusted. The notes spilled out like confessions. She remembered her mother's voice, soft, southern, always humming even when the fridge was empty. She remembered her first piano, discovered in a condemned church, keys missing like teeth, still beautiful in its brokenness. She remembered the nights she'd sat outside in the cold, playing not for tips, but for connection. For proof she still existed. The music soared, and the audience followed. There were no program notes, no familiar concerto. It was raw, personal, a soundtrack for a life lived too close to the margins. Someone in the front row began to weep silently. 2 seats down, a man who'd once donated $1 million to the symphony gripped the armrest of his chair as if holding on to a moment he couldn't afford to lose. Backstage, an usher whispered, "She's playing a soul into the room." The orchestra sat in silence, some bowing their heads, others wiping at their eyes. They weren't being ignored, they were being invited. And they knew, every one of them, that this was something sacred. Amara transitioned into a minor key, a shift so seamless it felt like a tide turning. Her hands moved like they had been born for this one night, this one piano, this one second in time when she was no longer forgotten. Then came a melody that none of them recognized, and yet it felt familiar. It sounded like something missing had just returned. In the wings, Victor took one step closer. His throat tightened. The piece? No, it couldn't be. A decade ago, in the shadows of a hospital room, he had written something after his wife passed. A private melody he never shared, never performed, never published. He had played it once, only once, alone. It was never written down. It was grief transcribed in silence. Now she was playing it, exactly, note for note, measure by measure. He stumbled back, as if struck. How could she have known? He remembered dimly a night 3 years ago when he left the conservatory in New Orleans, too drunk to cry, sitting on a bench near the cathedral. A street pianist was playing under the streetlight, soft, haunting. He hadn't stayed long, hadn't said a word. It was her. She had heard it, just once, and remembered it perfectly. Now she was giving it back to him, not to shame him, not to outdo him, but as a kind of offering, a musical absolution for a man too proud to weep in public. He sank into the nearest chair, his chest rising and falling like a man under water. Amara's hands slowed. The final notes trembled on the edge of air, then faded like breath on glass. Silence, a beat, then another. And then the room erupted. The applause hit like thunder, standing, shouting, roaring. Not polite, not reserved, unleashed. Amara stood, dazed, not in triumph but in disbelief. Her breath caught in her chest. She searched the crowd, unsure of what to do with so much love crashing toward her. Elaine returned to the stage, her eyes shining. She raised a hand for quiet, and the crowd obeyed. "This," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "is why we fight to fund music for every child who's ever been told they're not enough. Because they are. And tonight, we are the ones who didn't deserve her." She turned to Amara. "This gala raised a record amount tonight, but what you just gave us is priceless." The crowd roared again. Backstage, Victor sat in silence, head bowed. He didn't know whether to stand, to flee, or to surrender. But one truth remained. The stage no longer belonged to him. The audience knew it, the orchestra knew it, and somewhere in the quiet place beneath his grief and pride, even he knew it. Amara walked off stage as the crowd continued to clap. But this time she didn't exit through the service door. She walked through the center aisle where they reached out, not to stop her, but to thank her. Not with words, but with awe, reverence. And Victor Lang sat alone, wondering when the baton had passed, and how he had never even seen it happen. The sound of applause still echoed in the marble columns as Amara stepped into the backstage corridor, her chest rising and falling like the last tremor of a storm. For a moment, she didn't feel her feet on the ground. It was as if she were floating between two worlds, the one she had always known, and the one that had just impossibly opened its arms to her. A technician, still holding a headset, stopped in his tracks when he saw her. His mouth opened as if to say something profound, but no words came. He just placed a hand gently to his chest and nodded, reverently, as if he'd witnessed something sacred. She nodded back, quietly, and kept walking. Elaine waited for her in the hallway, arms outstretched. Amara hesitated for only a second before stepping into the embrace. It was not the touch of a stranger, but of someone who saw her completely, who had been waiting, whether consciously or not, for someone just like her. "You gave them something they didn't know they needed," Elaine said softly against her shoulder. "Do you realize that?" Amara pulled back, her eyes still wide with the disbelief of what had just happened. "I don't even know how I did it. I just played." Elaine took her hand and squeezed it. "That's what true musicians do. They don't perform, they reveal." Across the lobby, the energy was electric. People were abuzz with conversation, with awe, with a collective understanding that they had just witnessed something singular, something unrepeatable. But not everyone had been moved. In the small side corridor leading to the conductor's private lounge, Victor Lang sat in the shadows, a glass of untouched scotch balanced in his hand. The clamor of the gala faded behind the thick velvet curtains, leaving him in a bubble of silence, broken only by the occasional soft clink of ice melting in the glass. He hadn't moved since the performance ended. He couldn't. Because in the last half hour, something inside him had shattered, and what frightened him most was that he didn't miss it. He didn't miss the ego, the authority, the pomp. What he missed was the music. And that girl, no, that woman, had played it like she had snatched it from the stars and handed it back to him in pieces. He took a breath and stood, slowly, carefully, like a man returning from the dead. He followed the echoes of her footsteps, down the corridor, past the portraits of himself. She was standing near the far end of the hallway now, beside Elaine, laughing gently with one of the younger musicians. Her laugh, it wasn't loud. It was soft, warm, the kind of laugh that grew from pain and healed anyway. He felt like an intruder just standing near it. "Amara," she turned. Her smile faltered slightly, but she didn't flinch. "Maestro," she said, her tone calm but guarded. He hadn't heard that word sound so weightless in years. Coming from her, it held no fear, no awe. It was almost merciful. "I wanted to say something," he began, then paused. The words, so easily summoned for decades in interviews and speeches, now fought him like wolves. Amara waited, unblinking. "I was wrong." That alone drew a collective breath from the others nearby. Victor continued, eyes on hers, as if the world had collapsed into that single gaze. "I saw you and dismissed you before you ever touched the keys. I saw where you came from, not what you had to offer. I've stood on this stage for 30 years and never once have I felt what I felt tonight." He swallowed hard. "You reminded me why I started this in the first place. Before the reputation, before the politics, before I became someone I don't even recognize anymore." Amara said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was a mirror. Victor nodded slowly, as if to himself. "You don't need my approval. That much is clear. But if I have any decency left, I'll say it plainly. You were magnificent. And I hope the world doesn't try to mold you into someone else. We need what you are." He turned as if to walk away but paused again. "And if you'll allow me, I'd like to offer you something. Not as a favor, not as redemption, but as someone who finally remembered what it means to listen." Elaine's eyebrow arched subtly, listening. Victor met Amara's eyes. "There's a residency opening at the Philharmonic next season, a guest artist. Not to fill in but to lead, to teach if you're willing." A long silence stretched between them. Amara's hands instinctively touched her necklace, a silver pendant shaped like a single music note. Her mother had given it to her before everything fell apart. She looked at him, not with vengeance, not even suspicion, but with thoughtfulness. There had been too many days in her life when no one listened. Today, the world had listened. And somehow, even the man who had silenced her had found his ears. "I'll consider it," she said softly. It was enough. He nodded once, more humbled than he had ever been on any stage in his life, and stepped back into the shadow from which he came. Elaine leaned in. "You do realize you just made the most powerful man in the conservatory feel like a student." Amara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "No, I think I reminded him he used to be one." At that, Elaine let out a warm, quiet laugh. The evening wound down slowly, but no one truly left. Not yet. Not fully. They lingered, as people do when they know something sacred just happened and they're afraid to return to a world that won't understand it. One by one, donors and musicians approached Amara, not with rehearsed compliments, but with genuine, vulnerable gratitude. A woman handed her a pressed handkerchief and said, "You played my grief and made it beautiful." A father hugged her, saying, "I brought my daughter here to teach her about music, but you taught me something instead." Amara received them all graciously, humbly, but her eyes were scanning the room for one thing, her way back to herself. She stepped out once more through the lobby, retracing her earlier steps. The crowd had thinned now. The piano in the corner still sat there, unattended. She ran her fingers across it one last time, not to play, but to thank it. This instrument hadn't been grand. It hadn't carried her sound with the same resonance as the one on stage, but it had spoken for her before anyone knew her name. And tonight it had given her a way in. She smiled to herself and whispered, "Thank you," before turning to go. The night air outside was cool, sharp with early spring, laced with the scent of cherry blossoms from the courtyard trees. Her ride hadn't come yet, so she stood by the steps for a while, watching the city breathe. Her phone vibrated, a text from her best friend Miles. "I saw the stream. You did it. I'm crying in a bodega right now. When are we celebrating?" She smiled, typing slowly with cold fingers. "Tomorrow. Tonight, I just want to sit with it." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked up at the stars. One of them flickered, just slightly. It reminded her of a note held just long enough to tremble before fading. The morning after felt like waking up inside a different life. The cheap bed sheets of Amara's studio apartment still curled along her legs, the soft hum of the city filtering through the cracked window. But everything else, the air, the stillness, the way her heart beat against her ribs, it all felt foreign. Like the room couldn't contain what had happened the night before. She stared at the ceiling for a long while, her fingers curled around the pendant at her neck. The silence was different now. It wasn't empty, it was full. Brimming with all the unspoken words, the applause, the quiet stares, the shiver of change. She sat up slowly, her body aching in ways she hadn't noticed during the adrenaline of the night. Her fingertips were still sore. But the pain was familiar, comforting. It reminded her that none of it had been a dream. When she checked her phone, her notifications blinked like a sunrise. Hundreds of messages, mentions, tags. A video had gone viral. Her lobby performance, shaky and imperfect, filmed by that tech assistant, already edited and reshared by strangers who'd been moved by something they didn't have words for. The caption read, "She wasn't even on the program, but she became the program." And beneath it, a sea of comments. "I haven't cried like this in years. Who is she? Where can I hear more?" This is the sound of someone who's lived every note. Amara scrolled through them with a strange mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. Not through love. Most of her life, people had looked past her. Now they were looking for her. A knock at her door startled her. She froze. Nobody ever visited her here. Not without texting first. She hesitated, heart racing, and approached the door. Through the peephole stood a young woman in a tailored blazer, holding a thick envelope. Amara opened the door cautiously. "Miss James?" the woman asked, smiling warmly. "My name is Riley Thorne. I'm with the Carter Foundation." Amara blinked. "Elaine Carter?" Riley nodded. "She asked me to bring this to you, personally." She handed over the envelope. It was heavier than it looked, sealed with a gold crest. Amara stepped aside. "Would you like to come in?" Riley shook her head. "No need." She just said, "Make sure she gets it in her hands and let her open it in peace." With a quick nod and a genuine smile, Riley turned and disappeared down the hall. Amara closed the door and sat slowly at the edge of her bed, holding the envelope like it might shatter if she opened it too quickly. She took a breath and tore the seal. Inside, on thick ivory paper, were two things: a personal letter from Elaine Carter and a contract. The letter was written in blue ink, not printed. Handwritten. "My dearest Amara, last night you reminded me why I founded this foundation in the first place. Not to preserve tradition, but to break open space for voices the world has forgotten to hear. You've done more than just perform. You've healed. You've awakened something that had long gone dormant in all of us. I don't offer this lightly, nor as a charity. You don't need charity. What you need is a platform. Please accept the enclosed offer as the beginning of a partnership, one where you are no longer the exception in the lobby, but the headline on the stage." Attached to the letter was a 1-year full residency offer with the Philharmonic, funded entirely by the Carter Foundation. It included housing, a stipend, creative freedom, and most importantly, a choice of which pieces to perform or compose. Amara stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. Her eyes welled up, and for a moment, she didn't move. For years, she had played for tips and silence. Now she was being paid to create. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Miles, video calling without warning, like he always did. She answered, and his face lit up the screen. He was in a bagel shop, headphones on, grinning like a proud older brother. "Do you even know what's happening out here?" he shouted over the clatter of morning orders. Amara smiled, tears still fresh on her cheeks. "I'm starting to." He held up his phone to show a news segment playing on a mounted TV. Her face was frozen mid-performance in the corner of the screen, while a journalist called her a prodigy pulled from the city streets like a note plucked from heaven. Miles pulled the phone back and whispered, grinning, "They're calling you the miracle from Jackson Square." She laughed. "That sounds like the name of a saint or a storm." "Maybe you're a little of both." He paused, his voice softening. "You did it, Mar. You did the impossible." Amara looked down at the contract again, then out the window where the morning sun painted gold over the bricks and balconies of the neighborhood she'd called home for too long. "Now," she said quietly, I think I just started." Later that day, she made her way back to the concert hall, not for a performance but for herself. She wore simple jeans, a blouse that didn't quite fit right, and the same coat she'd had for 3 winters. But when she stepped into the building, people moved aside. Not out of fear or snobbery, but with reverence. Like they knew she belonged now. In the lobby, the same old piano sat in its place. She walked over, rested her fingers on the keys, and played just a few notes, quiet, familiar. Her fingers moved slowly, like they were saying thank you. Not to the piano, but to the path that had led her there. The gala banners had been taken down, the chairs had been stacked away, but the space was full of memory. Victor appeared quietly beside the door, not in a suit this time, just a sweater. Something unguarded. She looked up. He didn't say anything, but he raised one hand and nodded, a gesture of respect, of passing, of peace. She returned the nod, then stood, because there were more stages ahead, and this time she wouldn't be waiting by the door. It began again, not with a spotlight, but with a single knock. The Philharmonic's rehearsal room was grand but quiet, the kind of room that remembered centuries. Gold molding trimmed the ceilings, but the floorboards creaked faintly with every step, as if even time tiptoed inside. Amara stood in the doorway, staring at the space where her life was about to begin again. She'd arrived 10 minutes early. Old habits. She was holding her folder close to her chest, though she hadn't yet written a single new arrangement in it. What she carried wasn't paper. It was possibility. And possibility felt heavier than anything else she'd ever held. Inside, a few musicians were already unpacking their instruments. Some looked up as she stepped in. At first, they only offered polite nods, professional, reserved, but recognition softened their faces within seconds. A few exchanged glances, silent signals that said, "That's her." The girl from the gala. The miracle from the lobby. Amara offered a quiet smile and chose a seat not at the front, not at the back, just somewhere near the center. She wasn't there to dominate. She was there to listen, to learn, to earn her space like she always had, one note at a time. When the conductor walked in, not Victor, but a younger man named Marco Levant. He stopped mid-stride when he saw her. "Well," he said, his tone light but not dismissive, "I was told we had a guest artist joining us, but they didn't mention you already played circles around half the classical world." Laughter rippled gently across the room. Amara felt her cheeks warm, but her reply was steady. "I'm not here to outplay anyone. I'm here to play with you." Marco smiled. "Good. That's exactly what music needs more of." And so it began. The rehearsal was unlike anything she had known. There were no street sounds echoing through cracked subway tiles, no impatient passers-by tossing quarters without listening. Here the sound mattered. Every measure mattered. Every breath between rests carried weight. And yet, Amara didn't feel intimidated. She felt alive. The music wove through her like electricity, every crescendo a heartbeat, every pause a prayer. The pages in front of her weren't just notes, they were invitations, challenges, secret doors she had waited her whole life to unlock. During a short break, a violinist named Ezra slid over beside her. "You compose, right?" he asked, his voice low and curious. Amara nodded slowly. "I've seen you play your own stuff online. It's different. It's like your music breathes." She smiled. "I think it's just honest." He hesitated. "Would you ever let someone else play it?" That question caught her off guard. She'd never thought of it like that, her music in someone else's hands, her stories interpreted by other souls. The idea both thrilled and terrified her. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but maybe." Ezra grinned. "Well, if you ever say yes, I'd be honored." The second half of rehearsal flew by in waves. Amara didn't notice time, only rhythm, the way she always had. But it wasn't until rehearsal ended that the next chapter of her life truly came into focus. As she gathered her folder, Marco approached her with a thoughtful look. "Elaine Carter called me last night," he said gently. Amara stilled. "She told me she was offering you a performance night of your own at the end of the season." Amara's heart skipped. "You mean a full recital? Yours, your music, your choice of ensemble? We'll provide the orchestra, the space, the tech. But you choose what the audience hears." Amara didn't speak for a moment. The words were too large to fit inside her mouth. "We've never done that before," Marco added. But she insisted, said if we were serious about modernizing the season, it starts with real voices. Amara finally found her voice. "And you're okay with it?" Marco's eyes twinkled. "You're not here to be okay. You're here to be extraordinary." For the rest of the day, Amara walked as if the ground had softened beneath her, every step buoyed by something invisible and holy. That night she returned home and did something she hadn't done in months. She wrote. Not just melodies, stories. Pieces inspired by memory, by longing, by the woman on the subway who once gave her gloves in winter, by the boy who danced to her rhythm outside the grocery store. She wrote for the moments no one else saw, for the quiet kindness of strangers, for the rage of being overlooked, and for the beauty that survived anyway. Days turned into weeks. Rehearsals continued. Articles were written. A profile appeared in the New York Times, not just about her music, but about what it meant. How she was redefining the sound of resilience. The symphony received calls from schools, students, young composers who said they finally saw someone like them behind the piano. Then one evening, Amara received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a program from 10 years ago, stained slightly from time. It listed Victor Lang as the guest conductor of a youth competition final. Attached to it was a single handwritten note. "You played outside the hall that night. I didn't stop to listen. I should have. VL." She folded the paper carefully. There was no need to respond, because sometimes silence can say more than apology. Finally, the night of the performance arrived. The hall buzzed with a different kind of energy. Curious, electric, almost reverent. The audience didn't come expecting a concerto or a familiar suite. They came to hear her. Whatever she chose to give, she stepped onto the stage, this time in a simple black gown, no glitter, no embellishments, just her. And her story. She looked at the sea of faces. Her eyes paused on the front row. Elaine, Miles, Ezra, Victor, each one a thread in the tapestry that brought her here. Then, without a word, she sat and played. What came out wasn't one song. It was a journey. A symphony of becoming. She moved through sorrow and survival, through laughter and memory, through rage and surrender. She played the noise of subways and the hush of night skies. She played for the girl who once cried beneath a blanket of streetlight. She played until the room was no longer a concert hall but a cathedral of truth. And when the final note rang out, silence. Deep, sacred, then thunder. Not just applause, a roar. A wave of standing ovation that rose like a tide and did not fall. Amara stood. She did not bow deeply. She just looked at them. Not as a performer seeking approval, but as a woman who finally, unapologetically, knew she had arrived. It was never just about the music. Amara knew that now. Because the next morning, when she woke to another sea of messages, it wasn't the sound of her performance that people were writing about. It was the feeling. It was the quiet way she sat at the piano, spine straight and shoulders soft, like someone who had made peace with pain. It was the way her fingers moved, unrushed, certain, as if she'd buried 1,000 memories inside every chord and trusted the audience to find them. The world hadn't just heard her, it had felt her. And that was why, less than 24 hours later, the world began calling. She sat at her kitchen table in a bathrobe with chipped nail polish, staring at an email subject line that didn't feel real. Invitation, International Festival of Modern Classical Arts, Tokyo Mainstage Inquiry. There were others too. Prague, Berlin, São Paulo, even a request from a filmmaker in Los Angeles who wanted to license one of her original compositions for a closing scene about a woman learning to love again. She barely breathed. And just below that, another message. Urgent. Request for exclusive feature interview, Time magazine. She placed the phone down and covered her face with both hands. How do you stay grounded when the world lifts you so quickly? She glanced at the wall beside her, a framed photo of her mother from years ago, holding a young Amara in her lap beside an upright piano with a cracked middle C. They were both laughing in the photo. Not because everything was perfect, but because the music had always been enough. Her eyes filled, slowly, but she didn't cry. Not yet, because another knock came at the door. This one wasn't from a journalist or a representative. It was Miles. She opened the door and saw him standing there with 2 paper bags, a bouquet of sunflowers, and a look on his face that said everything he didn't have the right words to say. I brought the good kind of bagels, he said, and flowers, because you're famous now and probably too fancy for me. She pulled him into a hug before he could make another joke. They sat on the floor of her living room, eating breakfast like they had back in the days when they couldn't afford plates. And for a while, they didn't talk about the concert or the headlines. They just laughed about how bad his handwriting still was, and how she'd once dropped an entire keyboard on her foot and finished the set anyway. Eventually, he grew quiet. You know, this means you're not going to be able to go anywhere anymore without someone recognizing you, right? Amara tilted her head. I'm not Beyoncé, Miles. You might as well be. You made people feel something again. And that's rarer than anything. There was a pause. Then he said gently, You ready for all this? She didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands. I don't know if anyone's ever ready, but I know I don't want to run from it. And she didn't. Later that week, she returned to the Philharmonic for another rehearsal. This time, it was different, not because of how they looked at her, but because of how she looked at herself. She was no longer unsure. She was steady, rooted, a presence. Even the air around her felt different, charged, but calm. But when the rehearsal wrapped and she packed up her music, she noticed someone lingering by the exit. Victor. He stood by the tall double doors, hands folded in front of him, not blocking her path, just waiting. She approached slowly. He didn't speak first. She did. Why are you here? His eyes, always so unreadable on stage, now held something softer. Not sorrow, not shame, something closer to recognition. I came to ask a question, he said, one I should have asked a long time ago. She tilted her head, curious but cautious. He stepped slightly closer. How did you remember the piece? There it was, that single, aching melody he had written alone in grief, played once in the dark, a melody not meant for the world, a secret stitched into sound. She paused before answering. I didn't remember it, she said. I felt it. You played it that night near the cathedral. You didn't know anyone was listening, but I was. His breath caught. It stayed with me, she continued, like a scar, like a prayer someone whispered and then forgot. He blinked quickly, and for a moment she thought he might speak. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded. You gave it back to me, he said. You made it beautiful. It already was, she replied. It just needed to be heard. He hesitated, then reached into the inside of his coat. When he handed her the object, her breath hitched. It was his baton, worn, aged, the handle darkened from years of sweat and memory. I don't conduct anymore, he said simply, and I don't think I ever will again. But this belongs to someone who can carry it forward. She took it slowly, reverently, as if he had just handed her the weight of everything he'd ever tried to be. I'm not a conductor, she whispered. Not yet, he replied. Then he turned and left. No applause, no grand farewell, just the soft hush of someone letting go. That night, Amara placed the baton beside her bed, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what could be rebuilt, of what could be passed on, of what music could do when it stopped performing and started telling the truth. She stayed up long after the streetlights blinked out, scribbling notes into her journal, humming fragments into her phone, writing the outline of a new composition titled simply Inheritance. And she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that she hadn't just taken someone's career. She had inherited a legacy, and now it was hers to reimagine. The days that followed were quiet, but not the kind of silence Amara had grown used to. This was the kind of silence that hummed. It was full, electric, pregnant with possibility. She spent her mornings at the conservatory, where she had been given a studio space with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the sculpture garden. The walls were lined with books and fading portraits of composers, most of them men, most of them long gone. But her piano was alive, sleek and polished, waiting with patient breath. She kept the baton Victor had given her on the music stand, not as a symbol of conquest, but of respect. It stood like a memory, a thread tying the past to the future. She hadn't used it yet. She wasn't sure if she would. For now, she let her fingers speak first. She wrote with a kind of urgency that felt like healing. Melodies that came to her while riding the bus, while stirring soup, while dreaming. She recorded fragments on napkins, voicemail apps, the backs of envelopes. Her music no longer asked for permission. It arrived, boldly, without apology. And in between composing, she taught. At first, the conservatory board had offered it as a novelty. Youngest guest instructor in the program's history. The headline had read. But Amara had no interest in novelty. She taught the way she played, honestly. She didn't care about status or posture or the academic way of discussing meter. She asked her students one question. What are you afraid to say out loud? And how can you say it through the piano? That question cracked them open. One by one, they came forward. A shy girl with calloused fingertips who had never played for her own father. A boy who confessed he only practiced when he couldn't sleep, because that's when the music stopped sounding like an assignment and started sounding like breathing. An older woman, nearly 60, who sat in the back of the classroom for weeks before finally revealing that she'd once given up on playing when her husband called it a waste of time. They came to her not for perfection, but for permission. And she gave it freely. One afternoon, as she sat on the floor of her studio surrounded by torn manuscript pages and an empty coffee mug, Elaine Carter dropped by unannounced. She wore a navy coat and no makeup, just the kind of presence that needed no armor. She sat beside Amara without asking. They didn't speak for a moment. Outside the window, autumn leaves moved like music across the ground. Then Elaine looked at her. "Do you remember what you played that night?" she asked softly. Amara thought for a moment. Some of it, but not all. It wasn't a piece, it was just what needed to be said. Elaine nodded slowly, folding her hands. "It changed me." Her voice cracked slightly. She didn't flinch. "I've been running this foundation for 20 years. I've seen talent, but I've rarely seen truth. That's what you gave us. That's what they don't teach in these halls." Amara listened, humbled. Elaine reached into her coat pocket and took out a folded slip of paper. "There's going to be a summit this winter in Vienna. World composers, performers, artistic leaders. It's not a concert. It's a conversation. A place where culture is shaped before the world even knows it. I want you to speak." Amara blinked. "I'm not." Elaine raised a hand gently. "Don't say you're not ready. You are. What you've lived, what you've endured, is the reason they need to hear you." Amara took the paper with careful hands. She looked down at the crisp lettering, the embossed seal. She felt that familiar rush, equal parts fear and awe. "What would I even say?" she whispered. Elaine smiled. whatever the world needs to remember. That night, Amara sat by her window and watched the city breathe. She thought about how far she'd come, from sidewalk corners and borrowed gloves to marble halls and international stages. But it wasn't the fame that filled her chest. It was the meaning, the way her story had become a doorway for others, the way her pain had rippled outward and become someone else's permission to dream. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she played. She wrote a new piece. One that began with the sound of footsteps on concrete. One that grew into a melody soaked in winter rain and soft defiance. One that held the shape of her mother's laughter and her own voice saying, "I still belong here, even now." It ended not in triumph, but in tenderness. A single note, held long enough to tremble, then fade. The next morning, Amara walked into the conservatory with a printed score in hand. She found Marco Levant, who was adjusting rehearsal schedules at the front office. "I finished it," she said simply. He looked up. "The piece for your final performance?" She nodded. He took the folder gently, scanned the first few lines, and raised his brows. "This is beautiful." "It's called Inheritance," she said. Marco closed the folder. "Would you be open to something?" Amara tilted her head. "I want this piece to be our closing number for the Winter Gala. Full orchestra, you conduct." Her breath caught. "Marco, I've never." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've led from the shadows long enough. This time, lead from the front." She swallowed hard, nodded once, and walked away before her legs could second-guess her courage. For the next few weeks, she rehearsed with the orchestra, this time from a podium, baton in hand. It felt strange at first, like she was wearing someone else's skin. But then, slowly, it became hers. She didn't mimic Victor. She didn't imitate anyone. Her hands moved like she was shaping light. Her cues came from instinct, from breath, from the same place her music had always been born. She didn't command, she invited, and they followed. On the night of the gala, she stepped onto the stage in front of an audience that included diplomats, critics, alumni, and former mentors who had once overlooked her. But she didn't look for approval. She raised her baton. The orchestra waited, and with a deep breath, Amara led them into a sound that was hers entirely. The baton hovered in the air like a promise, and when Amara brought it down, it was not with the weight of authority, but with the grace of someone who understood that music is not about power. It's about permission. The first notes of Inheritance rose into the hall like breath warming a cold room, delicate and unsure at first. Like the early moments of grief. The strings moved slowly, tremulously, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, her breath sinking with every bow stroke. But she wasn't thinking about perfection. She was thinking about her mother's humming in the kitchen, about the sound of coins clinking into her open case on a snowy corner, about Miles cheering for her outside that dive bar in Baton Rouge after she'd played for a crowd of 5, about Victor Lang sitting somewhere in the 4th row, quiet and watchful. The room faded. All that remained was the sound, and then came the part that had terrified her to write, the solo. The piano entered like a secret. A melody she had pulled from the corners of her memory, wrapped in the tenderness of her past and the fire of her defiance. She conducted the pianist's entrance with a barely visible nod, and the young woman at the keys, a student Amara had mentored, played it like she was holding someone's heart in her hands. That was the point. Inheritance wasn't about legacy in the classical sense. It wasn't about passing down fame or applause. It was about the quiet, aching strength passed from mother to daughter, from one broken pianist to another, from someone who had been silenced to someone now offering a voice. The piece built slowly, layer by layer. Winds joined, the cellos stirred, and then at the center of it all, the percussion whispered like distant thunder. It wasn't bombastic, it was patient, like the universe itself was waiting. And then came the moment Amara had feared the most, the conductor's rest. For 10 full measures she had written herself into stillness. No cue, no baton, just her body, breathing, watching, trusting that the music would go on without her. And it did. The orchestra carried the piece like they had always known it. She stood with arms lowered, her silhouette lit from behind, and watched what she had made come alive without her needing to push it. It was perhaps the most vulnerable thing she had ever done, stepping back and letting the story speak for itself. When the climax arrived, it did not shout. It rose, a quiet crescendo, as if the entire symphony were lifting its face to the sky. And then, like all things true and beautiful, it let go. The final chord held for exactly 3 counts. No vibrato, no embellishment, just pure, naked harmony. Amara held it in the air a moment longer, then closed her eyes and lowered her hands. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for applause. It simply sits in the chest and waits for the world to return. And then, as if one person breathed out and another breathed in, the audience stood. Not a scattered rustle, a collective rising. The ovation was thunderous. Yes, but it was reverent. The kind of clapping that felt like gratitude, not celebration. A quiet sort of awe. Amara didn't bow, not right away. She turned to the orchestra first, extended her hand to the pianist and motioned them to stand with her. It was never about her alone. She bowed with them, not in front of them. In the wings, Elaine Carter wiped tears from her eyes, clutching the armrest of her chair as if she were holding a child's hand. Beside her, Miles stood with both fists raised in the air, tears streaking his cheeks like triumph. And in the 4th row, Victor Lang sat still, his face unreadable, his hands folded but his eyes wet. He didn't clap at first. He simply watched, as if he were afraid that if he moved, he might break something inside himself that had just finally begun to heal. When the lights came up, people lingered in their seats, unwilling to leave. And backstage, Amara sat alone in the dressing room she once would have been too afraid to enter. She looked into the mirror, not at her reflection, but through it. As if trying to find the girl she had once been, she found her. Still sitting at a subway piano, fingers numb from the cold, head bowed so no one could see the tears. She whispered to her softly, "I didn't leave you behind, I brought you with me." A knock at the door pulled her gently back. It was Marco. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood in the doorway, his expression full of quiet pride. "Congratulations," he finally said. Amara gave a small smile. "Did I scare the board?" Marco chuckled. "They've already drafted next year's theme, Truth in Sound. I think you've set a new standard." She nodded, her throat tightening. But then he added, "There's someone else here," said he didn't want to leave without saying something. She looked up. Victor. He entered a moment later. No longer the maestro, just a man. He carried nothing in his hands, no baton, no music, only his presence. "I wanted to thank you," he said softly. She raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For proving me wrong. For proving me isn't the end of music. For proving music doesn't need to come from a pedestal to reach the heavens." She didn't know what to say, so he continued. "You didn't just take the stage tonight, you changed it." He stepped closer and extended his hand. "I know it's not my place to bless the future anymore, but if you'll allow it, I'd like to support it." She looked down at his hand for a moment, then placed hers in it. "Not as a student. Not as a rival, but as an equal." "Support it," she said. "Just don't try to control it." Victor smiled. "I don't think the future can be controlled anymore." They stood for a moment in quiet understanding, then parted ways with no need for anything more. Later that night, Amara stepped out into the cold and walked the long way home. Past the jazz clubs still pulsing with life, past the statue of Louis Armstrong. Past the same street corner where she once used to play for strangers who rarely looked twice. She stopped there, just for a second, closed her eyes, and placed her hand on the piano-shaped scar inside her chest, the one that used to ache with hunger, with longing. Tonight, it didn't hurt. It hummed. Snow fell the morning her name was etched in bronze. A quiet dusting, the kind that softened every sound and made the world seem suspended. Outside the conservatory gates, a modest crowd gathered, faculty, students, musicians, and neighbors who had heard whispers of a ceremony too intimate to be advertised, but too important not to attend. Amara arrived without fanfare, wearing a simple wool coat, her curls swept up, gloves tucked beneath one arm. She hadn't told the press. She hadn't invited cameras. Today wasn't about performance, it was about permanence. Elaine Carter stood by the new garden, a gloved hand resting lightly on the black sheet that veiled the monument. When she saw Amara, her expression warmed with something between pride and peace. They didn't need to speak. A quiet nod passed between them, a shared breath of understanding. Beside the stone, Miles stood holding a thermos of coffee, bouncing slightly on his toes to keep warm. He looked at her like he always did, like the world had finally figured out what he'd known all along. The dean of the conservatory stepped forward with a small note in his hand. "Today," he began, "we recognize a name not because it rose in the halls of tradition, but because it climbed from the corners of streets, from benches worn by sorrow, and still reached toward the sun." He turned toward Amara. "Because of you, the definition of excellence has changed here. It now means honesty. It means courage. It means soul." He lifted the cloth. The plaque shimmered in the soft white light. The Amara James Studio for Truth in Sound. Music is what we remember when words forget us. Amara blinked against the tears threatening to fall, not because she was overwhelmed, but because something inside her had finally come to rest. She stepped forward and placed her hand gently on the stone. Cold, solid, real. She hadn't imagined her place in the world. She had built it. One note, one rejection, one defiant performance at a time. Later that evening, after the crowd had gone and the stone stood alone beneath falling snow, she returned to the old upright piano in Jackson Square. The one that still leaned slightly to the left, the one that had once carried the sound of a lonely girl's hope. She sat, no audience, no cameras, just her, and played. Not for glory, not for healing, not even for memory. She played for the sound itself. Because she could. Because she had found a place where her music no longer needed to prove anything. It could just be. Across the square, a little girl paused, tugging on her father's coat sleeve. "Who is that?" she asked. The father squinted, then shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but she plays like she's writing a story with her heart." And in a way, she was. Every note said, "You do not have to be born into brilliance to become it. You do not have to be invited to the table to pull up a chair. You do not have to silence your scars to make something beautiful." Her story had begun in the cracks, but it would echo in concert halls and classrooms, in whispered songs, and in the hearts of girls like her, who one day might sit at that same bench and wonder if they were allowed to dream. And perhaps, hearing the faint memory of her melody on the wind, they'd know the answer. They already were. What if the very person the world dismissed was born to change how the world listens? Amara's journey reminds us that true greatness doesn't require permission. It only needs purpose. She wasn't trained in marble halls. She learned her scales between silence and struggle, between doubt and defiance. And yet, her music didn't just reach the stage, it redefined it. In a world that often values polish over passion, Amara proved that raw truth, spoken through the hands of someone who has lived every note, can silence even the proudest room. She faced rejection, humiliation, and doors slammed shut. But she didn't let it stop her. She didn't wait to be invited. She brought her whole self to the keys, and in doing so made space for others to do the same. Her story is for the unchosen, the unheard, the underestimated. You are not too late, you are not too broken, and you do not need permission to take up space. Play your melody. Tell your story. Because the world doesn't need another echo. It needs your voice.